For 23 years, I believed my son died the day he was born. I never got to hold him for more than a few seconds. I never got to name him out loud to anyone who mattered. I grieved a baby boy I barely got the chance to meet, and that grief became the quiet, permanent architecture of the rest of my life. I want to tell you, before anything else, that I'm not telling you this story for sympathy. I'm telling you because I need anyone, to understand exactly how a family can build a lie so complete that even the person living inside it never thinks to question it for over 2 decades. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I need to start at the beginning, because the ending doesn't make sense without it. I got pregnant at 17, in my last year of high school, with a boy named Daniel Brooks who I'd been dating since I was 15. I want to be honest about something most people skip over in stories like this one. I wasn't scared the way you'd expect a 17-year-old to be scared. I was terrified of my family's reaction, yes, and terrified of what it would mean for school, for my future, for every plan I'd have formed about who I might eventually become. But underneath all of that fear, from almost the exact moment I learned he existed, I loved that baby completely, instantly, in a way I genuinely hadn't expected to be capable of at 17 years old. Daniel and I talked about it constantly those first few months. We were young and naive in a lot of ways, but we weren't reckless about it. We had a plan, the kind of plan two 17-year-olds build with more hope than logistics. He'd work weekends at his uncle's auto shop. I'd finish school through an alternative program, and we'd figure out the rest together, the way you tell yourself you will when you're too young to fully understand how hard figuring it out actually becomes. My family did not share our optimism. My mother, Linda Mitchell, took the news with a kind of cold, controlled disappointment that I still remember more vividly than almost anything else from that entire year. My older sister, Rebecca, took it considerably worse. I need to tell you about Rebecca because nothing in this story makes sense without understanding exactly who she was to our family and exactly who I was beside her. Rebecca was 5 years older than me, and from as far back as I can remember, she was the daughter our entire family quietly organized itself around. Beautiful in the specific, effortless way that made other mothers compliment my mother in grocery store aisles. Brilliant in school without seeming to try especially hard for it. Ambitious in a way that our mother visibly adored, the kind of ambition that promised, even when Rebecca was still a teenager herself, that she was destined for something considerably larger than our small town. There's a specific memory I still carry from when I was maybe 9 years old, watching my mother help Rebecca rehearse a valedictorian speech she hadn't even officially been awarded yet, my mother's face glowing with a pride I rarely, if ever, saw directed at anything I'd done. I remember bringing home a perfect spelling test that same week and setting it on the kitchen counter, hoping someone might notice, and finding it still there, untouched, 3 days later. I don't say this to suggest my childhood was uniquely tragic. Plenty of families have a golden child and a quieter shadow beside them. I only say it because that dynamic, small and ordinary as it might sound on its own, became the soil everything else in this story eventually grew out of. I loved my sister. I want to say that clearly because it matters for understanding how complicated everything that came later actually was. But I also grew up entirely inside her shadow, the quieter, less remarkable younger sister who got compared to her constantly, almost never favorably. My mother used to say things like, "Rebecca never would have let this happen within earshot of me," during the early months of my pregnancy, never quite cruel enough to be confronted directly, but unmistakable enough that I understood exactly what she meant by it. Rebecca, for her part, barely spoke to me during those months at all. When she did, it was usually some version of the same theme, that I was throwing away opportunities she would have given anything for, that I was embarrassing the family, that I clearly didn't understand what I was actually giving up. There was one conversation in particular that I didn't fully understand the weight of until decades later. I remember her standing in my bedroom doorway, maybe 6 months into my pregnancy, watching me fold tiny baby clothes a coworker had given me, and saying, almost to herself, "Some people don't even have to try for this, and they still don't appreciate it." At 17, I assumed she simply meant I was too young and irresponsible to appreciate what I'd been given. I didn't yet understand, not for another 23 years, exactly what she'd actually been grieving in that doorway. I didn't fully understand at 17 that some of that anger might have been coming from somewhere considerably more complicated than simple judgment. I would understand that eventually, but not for over 2 decades. My pregnancy progressed without major incident until the final weeks, when I developed severe preeclampsia, a complication my doctors took seriously enough that I was admitted to the hospital nearly 10 days before my due date for close monitoring. I remember being frightened, genuinely frightened, in a way that made the family tension feel almost beside the point. I remember my blood pressure climbing despite the medication. I remember a nurse's face changing in a way that, even at 17, I understood meant something had shifted from concerning to urgent. I was rushed into an emergency delivery. I remember pieces of it, fragmented and disorienting the way trauma often is. Bright lights, urgent voices, my mother's hand gripping mine before someone gently moved her aside. I remember a single, overwhelming moment of hearing a baby cry, my baby, and feeling something in my chest crack open with a love so immediate and so enormous it frightened me almost as much as the complications had. Then, everything went dark. I was told later that I'd lost consciousness almost immediately afterward, that my blood pressure had spiked dangerously, that the medical team had needed to stabilize me before anything else could happen. When I woke up, hours later, my mother and Rebecca were both sitting beside my hospital bed, and I knew, before either of them said a single word, that something was wrong. My mother took my hand. Rebecca stood slightly behind her, her face unreadable in a way I'd later come to understand had taken considerable effort to maintain. "Sarah," my mother said, "your baby didn't make it. I'm so sorry." I don't have adequate words for what that moment actually felt like, even now, even after everything I eventually learned about it. I remember screaming. I remember my mother holding me while I screamed, her own face wet with what I believed, completely, was genuine grief. I remember asking over and over to see him, to hold him one more time, and being told, gently but firmly, that complications from the emergency delivery meant the hospital had already needed to handle things quickly, that there wasn't really anything left to see. There was no funeral. I asked about that too, in the weeks that followed, and was told, each time, some version of the same explanation, that given the medical circumstances, the hospital had handled everything internally, that a funeral wasn't really something that applied to a loss this small and this complicated. I was 17 years old, destroyed by grief, surrounded by a family telling me a consistent, carefully unified story, and I had absolutely no framework for questioning any of it. I simply believed them because the alternative, that the people who loved me might be lying about something this enormous, never once occurred to me as a possibility worth considering. I want to tell you honestly that I never fully recovered from that grief. I finished high school in a kind of numb fog I can barely remember clearly now. Daniel and I drifted apart within a year, neither of us equipped to carry a loss that size alongside each other at 18 years old. I moved away for college 2 years later, partly for opportunity and partly, I think, because I needed distance from a town and a family that I associated entirely with the worst thing that had ever happened to me. I built a quiet life after that, the kind of life people build around an absence rather than despite one. I became a physical therapist, settled in a small city 4 hours from my hometown, never married, never had another child, not entirely by choice and not entirely by accident either. There was a man, years later, named Robert, who I dated for almost 3 years and genuinely loved, who eventually asked me why I always seemed to flinch slightly whenever conversations turned toward children, why I'd never once brought up wanting any of my own. I never gave him a real answer, because I didn't fully have language for it myself, beyond the simple, exhausting truth that some part of me had decided, somewhere in my early 20s, that I had already used up whatever capacity I had for that particular kind of love, and spending it on someone new felt, in some confused, grief-warped way, like a betrayal of the son I'd lost. We eventually drifted apart, and I never fully explained why, even to myself. I visited my family occasionally for holidays, for the obligatory rhythm of staying connected without ever fully closing the distance that had opened between us the year I lost my son. My mother and I maintained a careful, polite relationship for the rest of her life, the kind built more on habit than genuine closeness. Rebecca and I spoke even less, mostly because I told myself for years, We'd simply grown into very different people, with very different lives. 23 years passed that way, the specific, quiet erosion of a grief you've simply learned to carry without ever fully setting down. My mother died last spring, suddenly, from a stroke that gave no warning at all, and I drove the 4 hours back to my hometown for her funeral with a grief that felt, in some strange way, considerably less complicated than the one I'd carried for over 2 decades. I loved my mother, despite everything, despite the distance, despite a relationship that had never quite recovered its original closeness after the year I lost my son. The funeral itself was small, exactly the kind of modest, dignified service my mother would have wanted. The reception afterward was held at Rebecca's house, a beautiful property in the same town I'd grown up in, considerably larger and more polished than anything our family had owned when we were young. I remember walking through the front door and feeling the specific, disorienting sensation of stepping backward into a life I'd spent 23 years deliberately building distance from. It was during that reception, standing near the kitchen with a cup of coffee I wasn't really drinking, that I saw him for the first time. He was standing across the room, talking quietly with one of Rebecca's neighbors, a young man who looked to be in his early 20s, tall, with dark hair and a way of standing that struck me, even from across a crowded room, as somehow deeply, impossibly familiar. I didn't recognize him. I had no reason to recognize him. But something happened in my chest looking at him that I have genuinely never been able to fully explain to anyone, before or since. A pull. An ache. The specific, overwhelming sensation of recognizing someone you've never actually met. I asked a cousin quietly who he was. "That's Ethan," she said. "Rebecca's son. You've met him before, haven't you?" I hadn't. I want to be honest about how strange that realization felt, standing in my sister's kitchen at our mother's funeral reception, understanding that my own nephew, a young man in his 20s, was someone I'd somehow managed to never once meet in person. Rebecca had mentioned him occasionally over the years, in the careful, distant way we mentioned most things about each other's lives by that point, but our paths had simply never crossed closely enough for an actual introduction. I couldn't stop looking at him for the rest of that afternoon. I told myself it was simply curiosity, the natural pull toward family you've somehow missed knowing. But underneath that explanation, something considerably less rational was happening, a feeling I genuinely couldn't name, except to say that some part of me, some old, buried, instinctive part, seemed to be recognizing him in a way the rest of me couldn't account for. I introduced myself to him properly before I left that evening. He was polite, a little reserved the way young men often are with relatives they barely know, working, he told me, as an electrician's apprentice, living about 20 minutes outside town. We talked for maybe 10 minutes total, nothing particularly meaningful, and yet I drove home that night unable to stop thinking about him, replaying small details of his face, his voice, the specific way he'd tilted his head while listening to me, in a way that felt less like idle curiosity and considerably more like my mind was trying, urgently, to tell me something I wasn't yet equipped to understand. It was nearly 2 weeks later, lying awake at 2 a.m, that the detail finally surfaced clearly enough for me to fully grasp it. Ethan had a birthmark, a small, distinctive reddish-brown mark just behind his left ear, partially hidden by his hairline. I'd noticed it during our conversation without consciously registering why it mattered, the way you notice things peripherally before your mind catches up to their significance. I sat up in bed that night, my heart pounding, because I knew that exact birthmark. I'd seen it my entire life, in the same precise location on my mother, on Rebecca, on myself, faintly, on the back of my own neck, hidden beneath my hair. It's a family trait, the kind of small, distinctive genetic marker that runs through generations without anyone ever thinking much about it. I'd seen it on cousins, on my grandmother, in old photographs, the unremarkable inheritance of shared blood. It meant nothing on its own. Family resemblances mean nothing on their own. Except Rebecca had told everyone for over 20 years that Ethan was her biological son. I told myself, repeatedly, over the following days, that I was building something out of nothing, the kind of desperate pattern-matching grief sometimes drives people toward, especially grief reactivated unexpectedly by a funeral, by an unfamiliar young man's face, by 23 years of unresolved loss finally finding somewhere irrational to land. I tried to let it go. I genuinely tried. I couldn't. Something kept pulling me back toward that night, toward the specific, unanswered gaps in my own memory of losing my son that I'd never once questioned in over 2 decades. I'd never seen his body. There had been no funeral. I'd been told the hospital handled everything, a phrase that, examined honestly for the first time in 23 years, suddenly struck me as strange enough to deserve actual scrutiny. I started, almost compulsively, going back through old photographs from that period of my life, searching for anything I might have missed at the time. I found a single photograph, taken at a family gathering roughly 8 months after I'd supposedly lost my son, showing Rebecca holding a newborn Ethan in her arms for what I'd always assumed, without ever questioning it, was simply one of the first photographs of her with her own new baby. Looking at it again, decades later, with fresh eyes and a fresh, terrible suspicion, I noticed something I'd never once registered before. Rebecca looked exhausted in that photograph, hollow around the eyes in a way that, at the time, I'd simply attributed to new motherhood, but that now, examined carefully, looked considerably more like the exhaustion of someone managing an enormous secret rather than simply a sleepless newborn. I requested my old hospital records nearly a month after the funeral, my hands shaking as I filled out the request form, telling myself I was simply seeking closure, that whatever I found would obviously, reasonably, confirm exactly what I'd been told all those years ago. The records that arrived were incomplete in ways that immediately troubled me. There was documentation of the emergency delivery itself, consistent with what I remembered. But the section detailing the infant's outcome was sparse, vague in a way that felt considerably more like an absence of documentation than a record of an actual infant death. No death certificate was included in the file at all. When I called the hospital directly to request one specifically, the records department, after considerable searching, informed me that they had no death certificate on file matching my son's birth date under either my name or the name I'd intended to give him. I sat with that information for days, unable to fully process what it might mean, because the alternative explanation, the only other explanation that made sense of records this incomplete, was too enormous to accept without considerably more proof than a missing document. I hired a private investigator named Carol Jennings, recommended by a colleague who specialized in adoption-related cases, and told her as calmly as I could manage exactly what I needed her to look into. She was kind, careful, and direct in a way I deeply appreciated during what was becoming one of the most disorienting experiences of my entire life. Carol's first update, almost 2 weeks in, was smaller than what eventually followed, but it kept me awake for days regardless. She'd located the nurse who had been on duty during my emergency delivery, a woman named Patricia Voss who had since retired and moved out of state. Patricia remembered the night with unusual clarity, Carol told me, because something about it had bothered her for years afterward in a way she'd never fully been able to articulate to anyone. She said your mother and sister specifically requested to handle the aftermath privately, Carol told me over the phone, her voice careful. She said it struck her as unusual at the time, but that hospital staff don't typically interrogate a grieving family's wishes during a moment like that. She told me she'd thought about that night more than once over the years, wondering if she should have asked more questions. What Carol found, over the following 6 weeks, dismantled 23 years of grief and replaced it with something I genuinely don't have adequate language to describe. There was no record anywhere of an infant death matching my son's birth date at that hospital. There was, however, a birth certificate filed 11 days after my emergency delivery in a different county, listing a baby boy born on a date that didn't quite match mine but fell within a range a corrupted or altered record could plausibly explain, with Rebecca Mitchell listed as the biological mother. Rebecca had given birth, according to every official record, exactly 11 days after I had. I called Carol the moment she shared that detail, my voice barely steady enough to form complete sentences. That's not possible, I said. I would have known if my sister was pregnant. I would have seen her. Someone would have mentioned it. Carol's answer, delivered as gently as the information allowed, explained everything and nothing all at once. According to a former nurse I managed to locate, who worked at a private maternity facility outside the county at the time, Your sister wasn't actually pregnant at all. She gave birth, biologically, to nothing. The birth certificate was filed based on documentation provided by your mother, who was present for the registration, claiming to be the attending midwife for a home birth that, as far as I can determine, never actually took place. I understood, in that exact moment, sitting alone in my kitchen with a phone pressed hard against my ear, exactly what had happened to my son. He hadn't died. He had been taken, deliberately, carefully, by the two people I had trusted most completely in the entire world, and given a new identity as my sister's biological child, while I was told, and believed completely, that I was grieving a death that had never actually occurred. I want to describe what that realization actually felt like because I don't think most people, thankfully, ever have to experience anything quite like it. It wasn't simply anger, although the anger arrived eventually, in waves I struggled to fully control. It was a specific, vertiginous collapse of an entire understanding of reality I'd built my whole adult life around. 23 years of grief, real grief, the kind that shapes every major decision you make afterward, suddenly revealed to have been grief for a loss that had never actually happened, replacing it instead with something almost impossible to process. My son was alive. My son had been alive the entire time, raised 20 minutes outside the town I grew up in, calling my own sister Mom for his entire life. I didn't confront Rebecca immediately. I want to be honest about how frightened I was during those first days, of what confronting her might actually mean, both legally and emotionally, for everyone involved, especially for Ethan, who had absolutely no idea his entire identity was built on a deception this enormous. I went back to my mother's belongings first, the boxes I'd inherited but hadn't yet fully gone through, searching for anything that might explain how, and more importantly why, she had helped orchestrate something this devastating against her own daughter. Before I found the lockbox, I spent 2 full evenings going through ordinary boxes of birthday cards, old recipes, photographs spanning decades of an entirely different version of my family's history than the one I now suspected was true. I found a card I'd sent my mother for her 60th birthday, years earlier, thanking her, in the easy, unknowing language of someone who still believed the story she'd been told, for always being there for me, especially during the hardest year of my life. I sat with that card for a long time, understanding, with a fresh wave of grief, exactly how completely I'd misdirected gratitude that I now understood belonged nowhere near the person it had actually been given to. I found it in a small fireproof lockbox, tucked at the bottom of a closet, containing a sealed envelope addressed simply to me, alongside a small digital recorder. My mother, it turned out, had anticipated this exact moment, had prepared for the possibility that I might eventually uncover the truth, and had left behind an explanation she apparently hadn't found the courage to deliver while she was still alive to witness my reaction to it. The letter was handwritten, several pages long, and I read it alone, sitting on my kitchen floor, the same place I'd absorbed Carol's initial discovery weeks earlier. I want to describe what it felt like, holding pages written in my mother's familiar, slightly looping handwriting, knowing before I'd read a single word that whatever was inside was going to rearrange, once again, an understanding of my own life I'd already had rearranged, once already that year. My hands were shaking badly enough that I had to set the pages down twice before I could actually begin reading them properly.
Sarah.
If you're reading this, it means you've finally found out the truth, and I am more sorry than these pages could ever properly express. I've carried this for 23 years, and the weight of it has not gotten lighter with time, the way I foolishly once hoped it might. Rebecca came to me, almost a year before you got pregnant, devastated by a diagnosis she'd received that she would never be able to carry a biological child of her own. She begged me not to tell anyone, including you, and I respected that, foolishly believing it was simply her private grief to carry quietly. When you became pregnant at 17, I watched something break in your sister that I should have recognized as dangerous far sooner than I actually did. She didn't see her pregnancy as a young woman's unplanned mistake. She saw it as an almost unbearable cruelty, the universe giving the daughter she considered less responsible something she desperately wanted and would apparently never have herself. I am not telling you this to excuse what we did. There is no excuse large enough to cover what we took from you. I am telling you because I need you to understand that this began, At least for Rebecca, from a place of genuine devastation, even though what grew out of that devastation became something considerably darker than either of us should have ever allowed ourselves to become. When you developed complications during delivery and your medical team needed to step away briefly to stabilize you, Rebecca was already in that hospital, already part of a plan I am deeply ashamed to admit I helped her construct in the days beforehand. We told the attending nurse, a young woman new enough to the unit not to question two grieving-sounding family members, that complications had occurred, that the family wished to handle arrangements privately rather than through standard hospital procedures. I do not know, to this day, exactly how much that nurse genuinely believed versus how much she simply didn't want to involve herself in what looked, from the outside, like a family's private tragedy. We took your son to a private facility Rebecca had already arranged, told you he had died, and built a new identity for him over the following days, weeks, and years, an identity I helped maintain through a falsified birth registration I am more ashamed of than almost anything else I have done in my entire life. I want you to know that Rebecca loved him completely, genuinely, from the very first moment she held him. Whatever else is true about how she became his mother, the love itself was never false. That doesn't excuse the lie underneath it. I understand that distinction may mean very little to you right now, and I understand if it never does. I am sorry, Sarah. I am sorry in a way I never found the courage to say while I was alive to watch your face, while you heard it. I hope, somehow, eventually, you find a way to build something real with the son this lie cost you 23 years of knowing. I sat with that letter for a long time before I could bring myself to listen to the accompanying recording, my mother's voice, recorded just months before her death, repeating much of the same confession in a voice considerably more fragile than I remembered from the woman who had once held my hand and told me, with what I believed was genuine grief, that my baby hadn't made it. I thought, sitting there with that letter still trembling slightly in my hands, about every careful, polite holiday visit we'd shared over the following 2 decades, every birthday card she'd sent, every ordinary, surface-level conversation we'd had about my work, her garden, the small, unremarkable texture of an adult mother-daughter relationship I'd always assumed was simply quieter than Rebecca's, because that's who I'd always been to her, the quieter daughter. I understood now, with a fresh and different kind of grief, that the distance between us hadn't been about who I was at all. It had been about what she was carrying. Every single time she looked at me, a guilt enormous enough that I now wondered whether some part of her polite distance had actually been a kind of self-protection, a way of not having to look too closely into my face and see, reflected back at her, exactly what she had helped take from me. I confronted Rebecca 2 weeks later, after consulting carefully with an attorney about exactly how to handle a situation this legally and emotionally complicated. I drove to her house in the early evening, the same house where I'd first seen Ethan standing across a crowded reception, and found her alone in her kitchen, the same kitchen, in fact, where this entire story had quietly, devastatingly begun. I laid the documents on her counter first. The incomplete hospital records. Carol's investigative findings. Our mother's letter. I watched my sister's face as she absorbed each piece, watched the careful, practiced composure she'd maintained for over 2 decades finally, completely collapse. For a long moment, she didn't say anything at all. She simply stood with both hands braced against the counter, staring down at the papers, her shoulders shaking with a kind of silent, devastated weeping I'd genuinely never witnessed from her before, not even at our father's funeral years earlier. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely recognizable, stripped of every ounce of the composed, accomplished confidence I'd watched her wear my entire life. I used to tell myself it was a kind of rescue, she said. That I was simply giving him a stable home, more stability than a 17-year-old and her boyfriend could realistically have offered him. I told myself that story so many times, Sarah, for so many years, that some mornings I genuinely believed it. Other mornings, especially after Mom passed, I'd wake up and the truth would just be sitting there in the room with me, and I couldn't manage to look away from it anymore. You don't understand what those years were like for me, she continued, her voice shaking. Watching you carry a baby so easily, so unexpectedly, when I had spent years quietly grieving something I'd never even told you about. I know that doesn't make it right. I have known every single day for 23 years that it doesn't make it right. But I need you to understand that I never once stopped loving him like he was actually mine, Sarah. That part was never a lie, even if everything around it was. He is actually yours, I said, and I want to be honest that my voice broke saying it, the specific, devastating complexity of a sentence that was both completely true and completely insufficient. He's been yours for 23 years. That's not something I can simply undo even now. But he was also mine, Rebecca. He was mine first. And you took that from both of us. She didn't argue with me. I think, by that point, she genuinely couldn't. Telling Ethan was, without question, the hardest conversation of my entire life, and I will be honest that I don't think I handled it perfectly. Before that conversation happened, though, I made another call I hadn't expected to need to make. I reached out to Daniel, Ethan's biological father, who I hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 decades beyond the occasional obligatory holiday message. I found his number through a mutual friend from high school, and I remember sitting in my car outside my own house for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself dial it. He didn't believe me at first, which I understood completely. "Sarah, that's not possible," he said, his voice tight with something between confusion and a grief I recognized immediately, because it mirrored my own. I sent him copies of Carol's findings that same evening, and he called me back at nearly midnight, his voice considerably different than it had been hours earlier. "I have a son," he said, the words clearly still foreign in his mouth. "I've had a son this entire time, and I never knew." He was quiet for a long moment before he asked the question I think had been sitting underneath everything else. "Does he know about me yet?" "Not yet," I told him. "I wanted to tell him about both of us together, if you're willing." Daniel cried on that phone call, openly, in a way I hadn't heard from him since we were teenagers ourselves, grieving a different kind of loss neither of us had been equipped to carry at 18. He asked if he could be there when I finally told Ethan the truth, and I told him I thought that was exactly right, that whatever this conversation became, Ethan deserved to meet both of the people who had actually created him, not just the one who had spent 23 years grieving him. We met at a neutral location, a quiet park near his apartment, Rebecca present but mostly silent, having insisted, with what I now recognize as genuine remorse rather than simple damage control, that he deserved to hear this directly rather than through any further layer of family management. Daniel stood a respectful distance away at first, clearly unsure of his place in a conversation this enormous, until Ethan, partway through, looked over at him and asked, quietly, "Are you him? Are you my father?" Daniel nodded, unable to speak for a moment, and I watched my son's face do something I will never forget, a kind of fracturing recognition, as if some part of him had been quietly waiting his entire life for a question he'd never consciously known to ask. I watched his entire understanding of his own identity collapse in real time, in a way that broke my heart even through my own enormous, complicated relief at finally being believed, finally being able to say the truth out loud to the one person it mattered most to. "So my whole life," he said, his voice flat with shock. "Everything, my birthday, my birth certificate, the woman I've called mom for 23 years, none of it was actually real. The love was real," I told him, echoing, almost without meaning to, the exact words my mother had written in that letter. "I think that's the only part of this I can promise you is actually true. Whatever else was built around it, the love both of us feel for you is real." He didn't speak to either of us for almost 3 weeks after that conversation. I understood, as much as it devastated me, that he needed that space, needed time to process an earthquake this large without either of us, the two women fighting over different versions of being his mother, adding more pressure to an already unbearable weight. I spent those 3 weeks in a strange, suspended kind of waiting I hadn't experienced since the original weeks after losing him, except this time the uncertainty ran in the opposite direction entirely. I knew he was alive. I knew exactly where he was. And I had absolutely no way of knowing whether the relationship I'd spent 23 years grieving the loss of would ever actually become something real, or whether I'd simply traded one kind of devastating absence for another, considerably crueler kind. I drove past the edge of his neighborhood twice during that period, never close enough to actually see his apartment, simply needing irrationally to be physically nearer to him for a few minutes before turning around and driving home again. Daniel called me during that waiting period too, processing his own version of the same uncertainty. We talked more during those 3 weeks than we had in the previous 20 years combined. Two people who had once been terrified teenagers together, now navigating an entirely new, equally terrifying kind of uncertainty as adults. There was something strange and almost comforting about grieving and hoping alongside the one other person who understood exactly what we'd both actually lost, and exactly what we were both now cautiously, fearfully hoping to regain. When he finally reached out, it was to me first, a short, careful text asking if I'd be willing to meet for coffee, just the two of us, no further explanations required yet, just the simple, tentative beginning of actually getting to know each other as the people we actually were, rather than the roles a lie had assigned us decades earlier. That first coffee meeting lasted almost 4 hours, far longer than either of us had probably expected going in. He asked me questions I hadn't anticipated, not really about the lie itself, but about me, about who I'd actually been at 17, what I dreamed of becoming before grief reorganized my entire adult life around an absence. I found myself telling him things I'd never fully articulated to anyone, including the strange, complicated guilt I'd carried for years over never having another child, a guilt I now understood, sitting across from the son I'd never actually lost, as a kind of unconscious loyalty to a grief that had never needed to exist in the first place. I won't pretend the months that followed were simple, or that they resolved into anything resembling the easy reconciliation people sometimes expect from stories like this one. Ethan and I built something slowly, carefully, full of awkward silences and tentative questions, and the specific, strange experience of two people getting to know each other as mother and son in real time, decades later than either of us should have ever had to. He still calls Rebecca Mom. I understood, eventually, that I needed to make peace with that 23 years of genuine, lived relationship couldn't simply be erased or transferred by a DNA test, no matter how devastating the lie underneath it had been. Rebecca and I have not fully reconciled, and I'm honest enough to admit we may never completely. I don't know if I will ever fully forgive what she did, even understanding, as I genuinely do now, the depth of pain that drove her toward it. But I've watched her, slowly, painfully, take real accountability in front of Ethan, refusing to minimize what she did even when it would have been easier for her to let him soften it on her behalf. That accountability has mattered, even if it hasn't erased everything underneath it. I think often about my mother's letter, about the specific, devastating honesty of her final confession, about a woman who carried genuine guilt for 23 years and still couldn't find the courage to deliver that confession to my face while she was alive to witness it. I've forgiven her, mostly, in the complicated, incomplete way you forgive someone you'll never get the chance to actually speak to about it directly. Ethan and I see each other regularly now, slowly building the kind of relationship that doesn't pretend to replace 23 lost years, but instead tries, carefully, to build something real out of whatever years remain ahead of us. He calls me Sarah, not Mom, and I've made peace with that too, understanding that the title matters considerably less than the relationship slowly, carefully growing underneath it. There was a moment, about 8 months after that conversation in the park, that I still think about often. Ethan came to visit me for a weekend. The first time he'd stayed at my house rather than meeting somewhere neutral, and on the second morning, I found him in my kitchen making coffee, moving around the space with an ease that hadn't been there during his first few visits. He told me, almost offhandedly, that he'd been having a recurring dream since he was a child, of a woman's voice singing something he could never quite remember the words to, and that he'd always assumed it was simply something his mind invented. He asked me, carefully, if I used to sing to him in those first hours before everything happened. I told him I had, a simple, off-key lullaby my own mother used to sing to me. He didn't say much after that. He just sat with his coffee for a long moment, and something quietly shifted between us that didn't need any further words attached to it. I don't know exactly what the rest of this relationship will eventually become. Some days it still feels fragile, built on a foundation neither of us fully chose for ourselves. Other days, like that morning in my kitchen, It feels like something genuinely, carefully real is being built, slowly enough to actually hold weight. If there's one thing I carry forward from everything I've described, it's this: grief built on a lie is still real grief while you're living inside it, and the truth, however long it takes to surface, however much devastation it brings with it, is almost always worth knowing in the end. If something in your own life has never quite added up, a gap in a story, a detail that doesn't sit right, a grief that feels somehow incomplete, trust that instinct enough to ask the harder questions, even when you're afraid of what the answers might actually be. Thank you for spending this time with me, and thank you for helping keep stories like this one alive.